Welcome to another episode of Fathers and Sons, everybody. Luke, how you doing?
I'm good, Dad. How are you today?
Good. Got my USA shirt, and it's not because of the World Cup, although have been watching the World Cup a little bit. Have you been watching?
A little bit. Everybody at work's talking about it. It's a
Yeah.
big deal. So
So this week we celebrate 4th of July, Independence Day, and it's
yeah,
a
we do.
particularly significant anniversary. It's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States of America. So we thought we would do kind of a little bit of a special Fathers and Sons episode today to talk about a father and son duo from our country's history, one of our founding fathers and his son, John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, one of my favorite founding fathers. And I want to kind of acknowledge that we've got some listeners. Most of our listeners are in the United States, but I know we do have some listeners outside the United States as well. We have listeners in Canada, listeners in Belize, in the Philippines, Australia, Kenya, and India. I also saw as I was looking at
Germany too. I'm gonna
and
shout that
Germany.
one out.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Germany. And maybe other countries as well. So we appreciate all of our listeners. And so, this is kind of a story from US history, but we'll hopefully be able to kind of explain things in a way that is accessible to everybody. Yeah. So let me just give kind of a quick overview of who these two guys are. John Adams was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the driving forces, in fact, behind the Declaration of Independence. He was a Massachusetts lawyer, born and raised in a place called Braintree, which is near Boston, and was a member of the Continental Congress, and was our first vice president under George Washington and second president of the United States. He was also one of our first diplomats. He was sent by the Continental Congress first to France, along with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, to negotiate loans and other diplomatic missions in France, and then to the Netherlands as well. And then he was also one of the team that negotiated the peace with Great Britain that ended the Revolutionary War. After that, he was our first minister, basically ambassador, to the United Kingdom, to the court of St. James, and met King George III, and actually found that he had a lot in common with the king, which is kind of an interesting vignette from his memoir.
Yeah, he did that kind of a lot. He was an interesting character in that. I mean, he gained notoriety for defending British soldiers after the Boston Massacre too, right? Because he
did.
believed in everyone's right to counsel, not
did.
because he necessarily agreed with them, but yeah, I think he's a cool character in history because he was very concerned with impartiality.
Yeah.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And while please interrupt. I know we both read some different things, and I'll show the books that kind of I relied on here in a second. But he was a fiery patriot and revolutionary. I mean, absolutely, and was had a price on his head and all of those things. But at the same time, as the United States matured, he actually advocated for a stronger relationship with Great Britain, with England, and was less a fan of the French Revolution, for example, than Thomas Jefferson was. And we'll probably get into the relationship with Jefferson. One of the most interesting relationships in our history in the founding. John Adams was married to Abigail Adams, who in her own right is one of the most interesting characters in the American founding. I think, the place of women at the time was a little bit different. But when you read the letters and the correspondence, she was every bit had just as much intellectual firepower as her husband, was just as much a patriot. And it's one of the great partnerships in parenting as well as in patriotism from the American Revolutionary period. And she's one of my personal heroes, Abigail Adams, often left to raise the kids by herself as her husband was off, being in the Congress and stuff like that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I think we have to give Abigail her due in that she was a political advisor to both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and was a voice behind some of the founding documents in our country. She was instrumental in the creation of sort of this democracy, this new new form of government.
Yeah,
I agree.
abs-
She's awesome, and she is a big part of why John Quincy Adams became president too, which we'll talk about.
absolutely. And I've read this book before years ago, and I picked it back up and kind of skimmed through it. But this book right here by David McCullough
I've seen that book around
on
our house
on our
many
shelf,
times.
yeah,
Yeah, that's like
you should read it.
it's a pillar of our family library.
It's just as much about Abigail as it is about John. There's actually a mini series based on this book where Paul Giamatti plays
Yep.
John Adams.
Another family favorite. I remember watching that as a kid.
So Abigail's great. And you mentioned her being an advisor to John Adams. She also had a vibrant correspondence with a few other of the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Her letters with Thomas Jefferson are also very important, and they talked about the founding and governing principles just as much as she talked to her husband about them. So
Hmm.
yeah, she's the real deal. So okay. So that's John Adams. He became the president. He was a one-termer. He didn't get reelected. It was like
Yeah.
smash mouth politics. Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, but they had a really serious political falling out and a difference of opinion about the role of the federal government and personal falling out as well. And Jefferson ended up running against him and beating him in his second go for the White House. Okay, so John Quincy Adams, I'll just real quick, and then we'll probably get into some of the details, was born in 1767. So, he was about 10 or 9 or 10 when the Revolutionary War began.
Yeah.
He was also a lawyer, practiced in Boston, and he was born in Braintree, in the same house that his father was born in, was named after his maternal grandfather. I forget the guy's first name, but Quincy was one of the
John Quincy. It was
John
Yeah,
Quincy.
John Quincy. Hmm.
So
Who died, I think,
definitely,
2 days after he was born.
that's right.
Right.
That's right. So definitely tied to heritage and family. I mean,
Yeah.
family was a big, big deal to the Adams, the Smiths, and the Quincy family. The town of Braintree, the town was actually, the name was then changed to Quincy. It's called Quincy, Massachusetts
Oh,
today.
interesting.
So the Quincy
Okay.
family was kind of the founding family of Braintree, Massachusetts, and that's the name of the town today. He accompanied his father in 1777 to Paris on the diplomatic mission. Just him.
So he was 10 at the
He was
time,
10
right?
years old. He was 10 years old, and he became a secretary to the mission. So by that time, he could already write very well in penmanship and could do some Latin and could do a little bit of Greek and, some of that kind of stuff. And his education continued under the tutelage of his father in Paris. He attended school with one of the grandsons of Benjamin Franklin in a French school. He learned to speak French nearly perfectly. He learned a number of different European languages. He spent many of his formative years in Europe with his father, in France, in Holland, later in some of the time in Russia and other places where he was either with his family or abroad studying and working. He went to Harvard, became a lawyer, practiced for a while, then got into politics, and then was sent abroad by George Washington as America's first representative no, I'm sorry, not our first representative, but as minister to Holland and then to Prussia, and became a diplomat. He was then Secretary of State under President
Monroe,
Brett,
yeah.
under
Yeah,
the
he
under
was the author, well, he was the Secretary of State who sort of came up with the Monroe Doctrine.
the Monroe Doctrine, which is having a resurgence under the
Mm,
current administration, right?
yeah.
And then he became the sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. Interesting little fact about John Quincy Adams is that after he also was a one-termer, didn't get reelected. He was
Yes.
actually not elected by the Electoral College. He was elected in the House of Representatives. Yeah, yeah. And so after he left the presidency, he ran for Congress, and he was elected to Congress and served for 17 years
Hmm.
representing the state of Massachusetts, and earned a reputation as an eloquent defender of basically what we would today call human rights and civil rights at a time when that was not particularly popular. He was an opponent of slavery, as was his father.
Yep.
And
They were they were the only two presidents, I think, in the first 6 or 7 who never owned slaves.
yeah, I did not
Trying
realize
to
that
remember. Yeah.
because the
Everybody
rest of
else
them
did.
were basically Virginians.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah. They were
yeah,
Southerners.
that's right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
John Quincy Adams, he came to be known as Old Man Eloquent.
Hmm.
There's a font actually that is named after him, and it mimics his handwriting from his diary, and it's called Old Man Eloquent. Kind of fun.
You mentioned his diary, and
Yes. Very important.
maybe we'll talk a little bit about his diary. One of the most significant primary sources for American history, still to this day, and
Yes.
especially the sort of diplomatic history of what was going on with our diplomatic mission to France, to Holland, during the Revolutionary War, and shortly thereafter, as the new American Republic was trying to create its space in the family of nations. He wrote every day.
He wrote 15,000 pages of diary. I mean, I think he kept it for 70 years or something. There's like 50 volumes of it, 15,000 pages of diary,
Yeah.
diary writing,
And
journal writing.
rarely missed a day. And it started when he was pretty young. I think he was about 14 or 15 when he started.
Yeah. So I think let's get into the parenting side. It sort of started as a homework assignment from his
That's
dad.
right.
So I think we want to talk a little bit about this relationship between John Adams and John Quincy Adams. They were very, very close, I think we could say, right? And they had a really interesting, probably relatively unique relationship in the way that John Adams and Abigail Adams had very high expectations for John Quincy. There's a letter from John Quincy Adams that I found. He was 7 years old. It's his first letter that he wrote to his dad. And he writes in this letter, "Sir, I have been trying ever since you went away to learn to write you a letter. I shall make poor work of it. But, sir, Mama says you will accept my endeavors and that my duty to you may be expressed in poor writing as well as good. I hope I grow to a better boy and that you will have no occasion to be ashamed of me when you return." So interesting. This little 7-year-old boy writing to his dad, "I hope you will accept my endeavors."
Does it
And you can,
mention where his father was at the time?
this is right after Adams left for the First Continental Congress.
Okay.
Yeah. So this was in 1774. And I think I read some of Abigail Adams' stuff too. You can hear Abigail's voice in that. Like she definitely was helping him and maybe dictating a little bit. But this little 7-year-old boy writing a letter to his dad, and he closes it, "I am, sir, your dutiful son, John
Yeah.
Quincy Adams."
That is so good. Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things there. So we were just talking before we started recording about how much of the father and son relationship between John and John Quincy was defined by John's absence, especially early in John Quincy's life. John Adams was a revolutionary. He was an outlaw. This was colonial America. Massachusetts was a colony. And while John Adams had been an upstanding citizen, was a member of the bar, had, as you said, defended the British troops who had been accused in the Boston Massacre of murdering colonial, whatever you want to call them, rioters, patriots, depending on your
Right.
perspective, and was, a believer in law and order. He was also a patriot and had believed that the tyranny of the crown had reached an intolerable state, and was a member of the Continental Congress and had supported independence. And so in the United States at the time, about maybe roughly a third of the people supported independence, roughly a third were very loyal to the crown, and roughly a third maybe were sort of like, we just want to be left alone.
Agnostic, yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so he was in that third. And so he was gone a lot. And a lot of the advice and the formation that John Adams gave to his son was via letter, via correspondence.
Yes. Letter writing, parenting through this correspondence. Parenting by mail.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the David McCullough book, there's some examples of some of John Adams' advice that he gave while he was away at the Continental Congress. He says things like, a taste for literature and a turn for business, united in the same person, never fails to make a great man. That's pretty classic.
It is. Yeah. You know who it reminds me of a little bit? I don't know how you feel about this comparison. It reminds me of Polonius.
I was wondering if you were going to say that from
Yeah.
Hamlet.
We've recorded an episode on Hamlet. So if you're interested in that, take a listen. But Polonius is the advisor to the old King Hamlet and then to King Claudius. And he's a little bit of a windbag.
Yeah.
And has a lot of these sayings. Also reminds me of Benjamin Franklin, the early to bed, early to rise, make a man healthy and wealthy and wise. I think it was a popular thing to have these short kind of
maxims.
Maxims. So I guess question for you on the effectiveness. John Adams was definitely eloquent, and he wrote a lot of letters.
He did.
To his son, to other people. What are your thoughts on how effective a parenting technique that was?
I've been thinking about that all week, and I've been thinking about as well, let me add another variable to the question, and then I'll come back and try to tell you what I think about it. Why did it work with John Quincy, with Johnny? They called him Johnny. Why did it work with John Quincy? Because it clearly did.
Yeah.
As we were talking before we started recording, John Adams and Abigail Adams identified John Quincy as an extremely talented, precocious young man early. And for some reason, they had sort of no doubt in their mind that he was destined for greatness. Now, they had other kids, their next son, Charles, Nabby, their daughter, they had other children. They didn't take all of them on these trips to Europe. They didn't, I think John Adams was a loving father to all of his children. There's no evidence that he, only loved John Quincy, but it seemed like he dedicated sort of special attention to John Quincy Adams' education. Like, why? Did he recognize some particular spark? Or are we just seeing that in hindsight because John Quincy Adams became the president? I don't know the answer to that. Let me read another quote from the same page, and that'll maybe in part kind of give you my view. John Adams then said, history, this is paraphrasing, was the true source of solid instruction. Adams wrote to the boy encouragingly. He must read Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. There was no better preparation, whatever part he was called to play on the stage of life. It was best read in the original Greek, of course. So he was telling him he needed to read Greek. But he could find a reliable translation among his father's books. So he encourages his son not only to read these things, but to read them in Greek. And then he points him to a book on his shelf. So to me, that's more than just an axiom or a maxim. That's sort of like, look, I've read this stuff. Yes. It's more sort of sharing his experience. And we could go through, I've got like all these like notes, all these tabs in this book about all these examples of times when he shared his specific experience of having enjoyed something or found something in a book, or, read Thucydides, read Tacitus, read the specific thing and go to my shelf and find it. So I think it's more than just a maxim.
I totally agree. As soon as I made that Polonius comparison, I sort of corrected myself, because the point of Polonius, the funny thing about Polonius, is that he is not living the things that he is preaching to his son in Hamlet, right? And John Adams is the opposite. So Polonius is kind of the caricature, the guy who wants to pretend to be John Adams. We talked about this with Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. A big part of the reason that Scout and Jem listen to their dad is his integrity. It's his, moral compass and living that same moral compass. John Adams was deeply integrous in the sense that he stuck to his principles, even to the detriment of his family life and his personal life, like almost to a fault, Yeah. This is, I think, a part of why his term was only, he was only a one-term president. He was just too good. in a sense, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Although I will say, I mean, I am a big John Adams fan, but he was also not very well liked by many
Hmm.
people. I mean, some people loved him. Some people
He
loved
was kind
him.
of acerbic and
He was
yeah.
acerbic. He was vain. He was easily wounded. Like he often felt, and he would complain in his letters to Abigail that he was being undervalued.
Interesting.
Those kinds of things. And so it's not to say that he was this, flawless paragon, but I do think that he meant what he said. And when
Hmm.
when he held up a principle to his children to meet, I think he definitely tried to meet those principles himself. You talked about the diary. He
Hmm.
talks a lot in his correspondence to his children about penmanship.
Yes, I was actually just going to bring this up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a letter. Let me see if I can find it. So in 1780, yeah, 1780, John Quincy writes a letter to John Adams, and he sends him this letter that has his self-assigned homework. He says, "My work for a day: Latin, Cicero, Erasmus, geography, geometry, for like all this stuff." And then he says, "As a young boy cannot apply himself to all those things and keep a remembrance of them all, I should desire of you that you would let me know what I must begin upon first." So he's asking his dad's advice.
Right.
And John Adams writes back, and he responds, but then he says, "P.S. Next time you write to me, I hope you will take more care to write well. Can't you keep a steadier hand?"
Yeah.
You know?
And we can scoff at that. And I have always, I remember thinking that, I don't know if you learned penmanship in school. I did.
I learned cursive when I was in like elementary school the first few years, but it was never, yeah, never like a write nice or you're going to be in trouble sort of a thing.
We did have that as,
Mm.
in I remember the bicentennial. I remember 1976. Now, I don't feel that old, but we did learn penmanship. And there was some sort of idea that sort of was an expression of your character. I don't know if that's true, but I think
Yeah. Yeah,
John
I think you
Adams
did.
believed it. Yeah.
And there's probably something to it, the control, you can only, sort of a self-mastery idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so I think this is interesting. I would agree with you about everything you've said so far, that John Adams he had these very high expectations for his son, his kids, but John Quincy specifically. And I would agree that it was effective in the sense that it led to John Quincy Adams. I read a lot of things that said John Quincy Adams' presidency was more successful than his dad's presidency, and that his political career was more successful, which I don't know if that's accurate because John Adams was instrumental in the actual revolution. John Quincy was a child during that time. But either way, right, John Quincy Adams definitely had a successful political career and did some pretty incredible things. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine being maybe one of the most influential pieces of U.S. policy or political philosophy ever created.
Yeah. And most impactful anyway.
Yeah, for sure. But I do think that if we're just talking about this from a parenting lens, there's definitely like some stuff in here that I think is kind of hard. The first letter that I read, the opening note to the relationship that we have is full of this fear of being a disappointment. John Quincy Adams was deeply, this idea of fulfilling your parents' expectations was deeply ingrained in him. And I
Yeah.
think he even said at one point, I can't find it in my notes right now, but I think he said at one point that the thing that was most important to him in life was like honoring his parents. And I do think that may have contributed to there were some negative impacts of that as well, negative effects of that as well. The first of those that I'll say is just that John Quincy Adams did this same thing with his kids. He had very high expectations for his children, and he tried to encourage them to live up to the same standards that John Adams and Abigail Adams had for him. And two of John Quincy's sons, ended up dying of essentially alcoholism and overbearing parent syndrome. I don't know if that's one of them, like very specifically committed suicide, and the understood reason was that he had made some mistakes and didn't want to disappoint his parents.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned that before we started recording, and I was not aware of that history, but I did think as I was like, researching and reviewing the parenting style, it worked with John Quincy Adams,
Yes.
but it doesn't always work.
Yeah,
This
agreed.
very high expectations, these not just high expectations, but overt attempt to form and to guide a child into a role of greatness. I mean, it was very clear, not just from John Adams, but also from Abigail, that you are destined for greatness. There's a quote. There's another book that I have from a guy called Samuel Flagg Bemis, who wrote a biography of John Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams and the Foundations of American Foreign Policy. Pretty good book. I haven't read the whole thing, but I skipped around a little bit, and I found an interesting quote from his mother, from Abigail Adams, who, again, is like one of my favorite people. And she says, talking about the Revolutionary period, she writes to her son, who's in France at the time, "These are times in which a genius would wish to live." His mother wrote to him, with an aching heart after the ship sailed forth with husband and children. "It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. Great necessities call out great virtues. When a mind is raised and animated by scenes that engage the heart, then those qualities, which would otherwise lie dormant, wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman." That's his mom who
That's
wrote that
beautiful.
down. It's beautiful. And he was 14.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you imagine? Those are some big shoes that your parents are setting up for you.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. I love it. But I can imagine that not every kid can put that weight on their shoulders. I imagine.
No, I agree. There's a letter from John Quincy that I think is pertinent here. He writes a letter back to John Adams, and he basically says, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I don't want to do my homework. I just want to play."
Yeah. Yeah.
But what's interesting is that he doesn't play. In the letter, he acknowledges his desire he talks about feeling like he wants to be out in the woods, hunting for eggs and like rolling in the mud. But in that same letter, he says, "I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to do my studies. I'm going to read my Greek." And I don't think all children would have had the wherewithal to do that. So John Quincy Adams probably was an exceptional child, an exceptional person, but even he had a very hard time with it. And I think this is really important and really interesting. John Adams sort of repented of the pressure that he put on his son later in life. There are several letters that he wrote to John Quincy when John Adams was a lot older, talking about how he wishes that he hadn't put so much pressure on him. And there's one when John Adams is in London. He's a little bit older. This is in I guess this isn't super far, but this is when he's in London, and he says, "We are comfortably situated here and have all enjoyed very good health, but home is home. You are surrounded by people who neither hate you nor fear you. I don't know how to do without one of my sons with me, but I am obliged to deny myself this pleasure." So there's this like deep and abiding desire that John Adams has for the good things in life and for peace and for his family. And this sense much later in life that he's sort of sad that he had to put these burdens onto John Quincy as a child. And I do think that some of that must have come from watching John Quincy's kids grow up and feel that same pressure.
Well,
But
yeah.
I'll say one more thing. All of this is also to say, there's the very famous quote, "I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, etc." So we can't take the parenting lessons out of the context in which they were in. I think that John Adams felt this immense pressure to build something new and better than had existed, and that the country was kind of the cost, or his family life and the ease with which he wishes he could have parented. It was maybe the cost of doing this great work.
Yeah. I've got a couple of thoughts about that. The first is that, like in every case, it's not all it's not all one thing or the other, right? Because as much as I think we've been talking about the pressure that he may have put, or I should say they,
Yes.
John and Abigail, may have put on John Quincy Adams, there were also many really wonderful moments that were documented in John Quincy's diary and in other letters and
Yeah.
other kinds of things, right? There were lots
True.
of,
True.
there's a really nice passage in the David McCullough book, especially in 1784 and 85. Abigail makes the journey. John Adams is already in France. He's one of the commissioners to France, along with Franklin and Jefferson. And he writes to Abigail and says, come to me. And John Quincy's with him, and she brings Nabby, their sister. And they go to France, and they live in France for not quite a year, but pretty significant period of time. And that's when they become such good friends with Thomas Jefferson. She becomes such good friends with Thomas Jefferson. And they spend almost every day together. And so they work during the day, and then they play cards and they talk and they do interesting social events, and they go and see Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI at night at Notre Dame, and they do different things. They go out to the opera, and they go to the symphony and the different things that Paris has to offer. And John Quincy Adams is the narrator of this time because of his diary. And we know about this time because of how he writes about it. And he writes, I mean, it is wonderful, and he loves it. And there's a great passage here that says, their days began early, with breakfast finished, weather permitting. John and John Quincy customarily set off for a 5 or 6 mile walk in the Bois de Boulogne before getting down to work. So they would go off and they would walk for 5 or 6 miles.
The Bois de Boulogne, let's give context, is probably a forest of some kind. They're out hiking,
like
basically.
Woods, out in the woods, right? So they're off in the woods. So you said, I wish I would be out in the woods. They went to the woods.
They did go to the woods. That's true.
Okay. So it isn't all one thing or the other. There's another story when they were I won't look it up, but when they were in Holland, in the Netherlands, and John Adams was in The Hague trying to get a loan from the Dutch. And that's a funny story, because at first he really likes the Dutch, but then he ends up hating the Dutch because they're just so parsimonious and they won't give up any money, and he can't get a loan from them.
Yeah.
But John Quincy Adams has the opportunity to study at Leiden University, which is one of the great universities of the world, which is in Amsterdam. So they're separated by they're like 40 miles apart or something like that. And they have this correspondence back and forth. And of course, John Quincy Adams is encouraging him to study the Greek, to study the Latin, to do all those things. But John Quincy Adams says, but I'd really like to buy a pair of ice skates. John Adams immediately says, absolutely. You're in Holland. You need to buy a pair of ice skates. You need to also,
I love that,
take care of your body. And all of these things should be done with reflection. And you have an opportunity to learn how to skate on the canals. Yes, you can have some money to buy ice skates. So,
I love that.
Yeah.
That's so cool. That's like a story where I feel like if you were writing that story today, if this was a Disney movie or something, John Adams would have said no. That would be no, you can't. And that's the character formation that causes the conflict or the struggle. But the fact that he says, yes, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm reminded of one last thing here that John Adams wrote to John Quincy Adams that I read, which is, you will ever remember that all the end of this study is to make you a good man. He was dedicated to the idea of trying to help his son become what he saw in his son, fulfilling his potential and achieving something that he knew would make his son, I'm not necessarily going to say happy, we've talked about this before, but live a good life.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in doing this podcast. I've become more and more interested in what lessons I can pull from this. How can I use this to make myself a better father? And I think something that I've learned and I've been thinking about from John Adams and John Quincy Adams is that lesson of read from good books, find good things, and try to make yourself into a good person for the betterment of your kids, and then pass that along. teach them. It's sort of the give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish. If you can teach your kids to learn and to be hungry for that, they will then have the tools to like make themselves into something better.
Yeah. Yeah. There was another example that came from the life of John Adams and John Quincy. When they were in Holland, there was an opportunity for John Quincy Adams to accompany another American diplomat who was assigned to go to the court of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg. I don't know if you read about this.
Is this when he was 14 or so?
He was about 14 years old, maybe 15.
Yeah, this is a crazy story. Tell this.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
And I forget the name of the guy, but he stayed close to John Adams later and was appointed later in his administration and that kind of thing. This is a person that John Adams trusted. He had been appointed to be minister to the court in
Francis
Russia.
Dana.
Dana, that's right. It's Francis Dana. But Dana didn't speak French. But
and French was
Quincy
the lingua franca, right?
That's right. The lingua franca. And the Russians all spoke French.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the language of diplomacy and the language of business at the time. And so John Quincy, even at the age of 14, spoke really good French. And so they cooked up this plan for John Quincy Adams to accompany Dana to St. Petersburg to act as Dana's aide. And he worked as essentially his secretary at the age of 14, his diplomatic secretary, like in basically doing what I do.
Yeah.
Like I'm a political officer. I'm technically a first secretary. That is my title. I'm a first secretary to the chief of mission. That is what he did at the age of 14 because his French was so good. And he was a mature, well-rounded, experienced young man who had been in France, who'd been in the Netherlands. He could do it. His father had. And I guess the point is, so not only did his father say, study the books, do all the stuff, he had faith in him and showed that faith by appointing him to do this kind of a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he did that a couple other times too. When John Adams was president, he appointed John Quincy to some positions, and it didn't ever, at least from what I read, from John Adams' perspective, it was never a nepotism move. It was, he had a lot of faith in his son.
Although he was criticized for it.
He was. And John Quincy Adams felt uncomfortable about it too. Yeah, but I don't think John Adams saw it that way.
He appointed him as minister to Prussia.
Yeah.
And he was criticized for it.
Germany, right? To Berlin.
That's right. Well, let's talk for just a second about, was it all worth it?
I feel like that's a recurring question we're getting to here.
I mean, okay, so a lot of what we've talked about was John Adams. I mean, we're not undertaking to give the full biography of either of these men. I mean, I think people should read the McCullough book. I think this is a really good book. I'm going to try to finish it. These are interesting men, interesting people, Abigail, and, the things they did for our country, the founding generation. It's almost hard to fathom the sacrifices. That's a recurring theme. And in fact, in France, when John Quincy Adams came back to Massachusetts to go to Harvard, one of his rationales was, my father, because he has been essentially dedicating his life to public service, has no fortune. I have no ability just to rely on my father. I have to be independent. I have to go home. I have to get an education. I have to work for a living because I have, my father has chosen to be a public servant. He recognized that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about these people fulfilling their destiny as sort of part of like political and professional achievement. But at the end of John Adams' life, when it was all said and done, he just wanted his son to come home. His son had been appointed to be minister to Great Britain. And it looked like Monroe was going to be elected, and Monroe was elected, and there was a rumor that John Adams was going to be appointed as Secretary of State.
John Quincy, right?
John Quincy. So McCullough says, during that autumn, this is 1816, it appeared that James Monroe was to be the next president, and the newspapers were reporting that John Quincy was the choice for Secretary of State. John Adams, sent off a letter to London saying he hoped it was true and that John Quincy would accept the offer and come home. If not true, Adams hoped he would come home anyway. Later, with still no word from London, again, this is mom, Abigail was more emphatic. This is the mom who said, this is how heroes and statesmen are made. This is what she said when she was in her 70s. The voice of the nation calls you home, she wrote. The government calls you home, and your parents unite in the call. To this summons, you must not, you cannot refuse your assent. They had not seen their son for 8 years.
Wow.
And then it says, in the history of the Adams family, there was probably no more joyful homecoming than took place in the heat of mid-morning on August 18th, 1817, when John Quincy, his wife Louisa Catherine, and their 3 sons came over the hill from Milton in a coach and 4, trailing a cloud of dust. And then it goes on to describe that homecoming. And he then did become Secretary of State. He negotiated, just to go through a few of his achievements as Secretary of State, negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty, which added Florida to the United States from Spain, shaped the Monroe Doctrine, as you said, and advanced U.S. expansion. That led, of course, to his election as president. He still was not present when either of his parents passed away. He was in Washington when both of them died, which he was very sad about.
Yeah.
But he was able to see his parents on a regular basis, coming up to Braintree roughly yearly from Washington. I don't know what reaction you have to all of that.
I think there are, as a modern kind of privileged person, there are elements to any historical event or story that I have to work past or sort of put to the side. But there are very few things that I find in this story that I dislike. I think that these were people who engaged deeply with a cause that was good and that they believed in, and that there were tragedies that occurred in their lives that I don't know that you can lay at their feet. I don't think you can lay entirely at their feet, but that there are good things in their lives and in the lives of others that you can give them credit for. And I think that's something to aspire to, this anxious engagement in a good cause. And I think John Adams demonstrated that to his son, lived it, and taught what he could of how to do the same thing in your own life. So, yeah, last maybe bookend to this. John Adams died on the 4th of July, same day as Thomas Jefferson. Very interesting event, and very famous. But John Quincy Adams' death is a little less well known, but I think it's equally interesting. John Quincy died inside the Capitol in the middle of a debate, essentially. He had, I think, an aneurysm while trying to continue the work he'd been doing his entire life. And I think he had, he took that from his dad. So is it all worth it? Like, I'm thinking of Luke Martin when he spoke with us a couple of weeks ago saying, what else would we have done?
Yeah. Yeah.
What else would they have done? There was a good cause. There was a need for these things. And there was a pressing kind of a philosophical urgency, a literal urgency to the things that John Adams taught his son and Abigail taught their son. So yes, I think it was.
I agree. I think that's a good place to stop. That's a wonderful story. I hope folks will maybe give some thought during this 4th of July celebration to the great things that people have done, to give us the freedoms and the privileges that we do have. And, we have a lot of work to do. Our country, I love our country. It is not perfect. We are not perfect. We still have work to do. So we can look around and find ways to be better.
Amen to that.
All right. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Dad. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen to this episode of Fathers and Sons. We'll catch you next time.
Talk to you later.